maybe what I'll do is give you a cuttable beginning because it is what set me on this train of thought. We were watching a film of Alias Grace, a fairly famous book now about a working woman that was charged with murder of her employer and found guilty, and then along comes a very caring, moral physician who has decided he wants to focus on psychological factors more than illness. And he interviews her over a long period of time, and she's respectful of him. He calls him sir and answers questions, and he becomes more and more convinced of her innocence. In the end, it emerged in his presence. She said, well, it wasn't exactly what I told him. I could see where he was going in his questions, and so I sort of directed my story along those lines. And I thought, right, that's what we do when we tell stories. You know, we size up our audience, the expectations, the potential interest that might be able to generate, even a moral that we might be able to make with this story. Is it something that this audience is likely to go for? You know, am I talking to grade 3 kids? Am I talking to, I don't know, Quakers or some general public audience? Or am I talking to an anthropology conference audience? Or even telling a story to some younger Crees that happens to be the case with the book I'm working on now. What are they going to go for? What can I do with the story? Okay. Now, there's one particular story that I like very much about the first man to have a Mastabeo, who in fact had several of them, and offended them, and then his wife sinned against them by trying to see them, what they looked like. And there are quite a number of versions of this story. And my predecessor at Waskaganish in the 1930s, when I was still in diapers, she was there recording stories. And in one of her publications, she mentions 4 or 5 versions of this Chewa story. Only one of them ends the way John Blackned's rendition ends. In the end, when he is survived by going up and giving all that he has, some tobacco, to the head Mastabeo, and then he's told that he can bring his wife, but she must not look at the people in the tent, because these men do not want a woman to look at them. And she waits until she thinks everybody's asleep, and then and all she can see is men. Okay? But in the morning, they're gone. The fire's gone. The covering of the tent is gone. She confesses to her husband that it's her fault. She tried to look at them, and so she sort of takes the blame. And it sounds at this point like an Adam and Eve story, but it has a different ending. She says, well, I guess now we have to find them and try to make it up to them. And he says, no. They demand too much. We'll just try to get our living without them. And I thought, way to go. It came because the first sin against them was when one of them appeared to Joah and said, in the fall you're going to have trouble getting food. Eventually you're going to be starving, and then you're going to kill a beaver, and I don't want you to feed the meat from that beaver to your kids. See, so really it's Mestabeo versus family. And Joah chooses family. I like that. So this story, the version that John told me, basically chooses family over power. Then along comes the book project and the wish to include a couple of myths in the book. What myths are we going to choose? Well, one of them is one that Stan particularly liked, and his mother told it to him, and he remembers a good deal of the version. And I like it too. It's about a man who, in his old age, takes a young second wife who is interested in the man's son. I think she's bored with the old man. She wants something more. Well, the old man had wanted something more. You know, he had a wife, he had a family, wasn't satisfied. So it seemed to us that this was a story about how greed enters the world and what happens. The old man wants a young wife. The young wife wants the handsome young son of the old man. The son, being a good son, refuses her. She's very angry at being turned down. And so, in the version that John Blackned told me, she takes a live partridge or ptarmigan and holds it between her legs, and it scratches her. And then she shows this to her old husband and says, "Your son did this." So the old man, of course, furious with jealousy, and so he doesn't show it to his son. He says instead, let's go out to the island out in the bay there and gather eggs. And out they go to gather eggs, and the old man keeps saying, no, try a little further inland. And when the young man has gone far enough inland, the old man climbs in the canoe and goes off and leaves him stranded on the island. As that story ends, there are alternative endings again, and there are important differences. In probably the most popular ending, the most recorded at least, the young man overcomes the obstacles put in his way magically by his father, with the aid of magic provided long distance by his mother. And he comes back, and he's, by this time, having overcome these obstacles, he has gained a good deal of personal power. And so after a test of his power, which he passes and the old man flunks, he tells the old man, the water's going to boil, the earth's going to burn. And he draws a circle, has his mother stand inside the circle, and he stands inside the circle. His father and the young wife outside the circle. And so he destroys the world, basically. Turns his mother into a robin and himself into a kind of small hawk. End of story. Except for a version that Stan's mom told him. And in that case, he does the fire and boiling water thing, but he turns his mother into a kind of terrain right at the shore of rivers where people might go to hunt geese, let's say, and makes it a nice area to get around on. And he turns himself into a kind of wood that is excellent for bows. So he's basically transforming the world with gifts for people yet to come. This goes from greed, then, to generosity. I really like that. And so, chose that version to go into the book. Now, that's taking a kind of license, I guess. Saying, well, this is the way the story goes. And it is the way the story goes, but it's not the only version. Not the only story. The other versions, which focus on the destruction of the world and the disappearance, really, a robin or a sparrowhawk or whatever it is, are not major gifts to what comes later. They're just sort of mementos of what went before, in a way. And so how much freedom can I feel comfortable taking in making those choices? Okay, well, I felt pretty comfortable, and so I pushed it a little further. One of the stories that we used is how first man and first woman came to this earth. They were lowered down in a basket by a spider. We don't know if it was that the spider was huge or that the people were made very small for the trip. But they are told that when they get to this earth, that they will be taught how to live there by a bear. And so after some difficulties, they arrive. The bear helps them. And at that point in the story, I say, here the story as we have it ends, but here's some of the things that the bear could have taught the people. And then I talk about how the bear takes them to see how beavers live, families, beaver house, helping each other, raising the children with some care, and so on. And their great strength is in their front teeth, and that indeed the maxilla of a beaver with the front teeth in it was used until fairly recently as a chisel. Picture, line drawing from Skinner's monograph, and good tool. And we go from there to other tools. The use of the leg bone of a moose or a caribou sharpened as a ice chisel or as a spear if it's pointed. The use of the rib bone of a caribou with a little leather wrapped around one end and then sharpened, used as a knife. These are things that John Blackned made for me. Okay, he didn't tell me that, the bear told humans how to do these things, but humans, in order to get their living, have to see how other animals get theirs. How do they get their food, so on. they have to have a spear, a knife, and so on. And we know what the spear points and the knives were made from. And so I took the liberty of making a little story around that. Now, I decided I was qualified to make a small myth. Okay. I'm less comfortable with that, on the other hand. I'm an elder and spent a lot of time on this stuff. I have a pretty good sense of the spirit of the stories, you might say, the morality of the stories. And it seems like them arriving on this earth, being helped by the bear, but then stopping. What kind of help? What could the bear have taught them? What did they need to know? Well, they needed to know that some animals work collaboratively and are good family members and have houses and get their food with the tools available to them, incisors and so on. Other kinds of animals, caribou, very important, but they don't live that way. Caribou are on the move all the time. They don't live in tents or houses. They are protected from the elements by their fur. Humans don't have that. So probably the first man and the first woman would not have chosen to try to live like caribou. Probably beavers would be a very good example of how they might live. I made that choice. So there we are. It's a late career move. It's reckless in a sense. Not very. Plausible anyway. And if somebody else telling that story, some old Cree guy, had decided that it needed more of an explanation, it might have been this sort of thing that would have come up. You look at the tools that humans have in order to get their living, and that trying to follow the caribou all the time is pretty arduous. And beavers are there, and if you need them, you can kill one and eat it, and it's very good food. Bears hibernate, but humans don't have that luxury. Bears are very good food, but bears are hibernating alone. The pregnant female goes into her own den. The male goes into his own den. The male may not approach the female with young, or she will fight, because he will kill them. So that wasn't the way to go. That eliminates one likely candidate. Okay, bears are very smart, very capable. They live pretty well, tend to be free from starvation. Beavers tend to be doing pretty well there too. They can hole up in the winter and use food that they've saved. The ice preserves it. Humans don't preserve it with ice, they preserve it by drying it. Okay, have we got any other candidates? I couldn't think of any other likely ones. Maybe there are some. Maybe there's a really good candidate that I just know nothing about. Maybe not. So that was my decision. Now, maybe we'll get some pushback from somebody that thinks that I shouldn't be meddling around with old Cree stories. And maybe they're right or maybe they're wrong. we'll see what happens there. So far, no pushback. But we haven't got all the returns in yet. Anyway, it strikes me that there is behind this a kind of a general issue that I'm speaking to, and that is that we're interested in the fact that there's great stability in these old stories. You know, the Jesuits in the 1600s recorded a few stories, and lo and behold, we get pretty much the same stories 300 years later. Well, then, how are we going to hold that up against stories being tailored to the audience? What's stable and what isn't stable? What change is allowed? What change is chosen? And it seems to me that that's the question that has to be addressed in order to deal with this idea of the extraordinary stability of story plots and so on, and yet the variation, even in the same story, different people are telling it different ways. Old John told me, you know, when people tell this story, everybody tells it their own way. And yet, you know, if it's Joe's story, it's going to be pretty much the same story. If it's Ayash with the young wife, it's going to be pretty much the same story, but not exactly. There's some wiggle room there, and I've chosen to wiggle, and I don't feel apologetic to the stories, and that's where my morality really sits. I have to do justice to not just these particular stories, but to the whole corpus of stories. And that's what my book did, I think, and I still think so. And that's what I think we're doing with this new book, with a couple of stories. We're letting them serve a purpose by choosing the variation that we've chosen, and in this case, the addition that I've chosen, because young people now won't realize that people used to use the maxilla of the beaver as a chisel, and it was a very useful tool, used a good deal. And you can picture somebody making a wooden plate gouging it out with a chisel. You'd have to have the ability to do that. Or the knife from the leg bone, or the smaller knives from rib bones, spear points, ice chisels. You have to know a little bit about bones. And if you grew up in town, you might not. So it seems like in order to bring those kids up to speed, you have to tell them a little bit. Okay, well, that's pretty much that story.
Okay. That was very good.